So today's lecture follows on pretty directly from last week's lecture on the dynamic web. So today we're going to look at content management systems, CMSs, and specifically at the Wordpress CMS, and then we'll have a little bit of an overview of WordPress theme development, which we'll then look at in more detail in the tutorials. So just a little bit of a recap on the important points from last week. We looked at the trends in the evolution of web design and web development. And so some of the things that we came up with were that we had more content, which was more frequently updated and more frequently on demand, and from lots more sources, so multiple contributors to a website, including the users as a contributor to the content of the websites as well. And then within a development or a design content creation team, a lot more varied roles. So as opposed to having maybe one person in charge of everything in a website, from the design, the development, and the content updating, these roles are distributed amongst usually multiple people depending on the scale of the website. And so as a web designer, you at least need to have some sort of understanding across more roles or more specialized areas than you may have had to in the past. We looked at the dynamic website model, where website content is stored in a database and/or other external sources and assembled with markup and output by a web server script application. Specifically, we looked at the PHP scripting language, which sort of forms this part of the model here, which provides us with our conditional logic and automation and all of the nice things that hopefully were demonstrated in the tutorials last week. So we saw that some of the advantages of dynamic websites are that content can be updated in a decentralized way, meaning that a single webmaster does not have the sole privilege or responsibility of updating the website. We can modularize our code. So again, we saw that in the tutorials, whereby rather than, if we have a series of pages, rather than having to maintain each section and duplicate it across a bunch of pages, we can split those common bits of code off and maintain them as one single unit of code, and then using PHP we can combine them back in to the ultimate end output. And then we've also got automation of tasks, which we'll talk to more later. Okay, so at this point we had sort of hopefully agreed that in the current environment of web design, of websites, that really dynamic websites are the solution that's either preferred or in some cases just absolutely required in order to solve some web application design problems. So what is a content management system, and specifically a web content management system? Okay, so I'll use these terms interchangeably, and you'll generally see them used interchangeably, but we should at some point say we're very specifically talking about web content management systems, because we can have content management systems that don't manage web-based content. But from here on in, I'm just going to refer to them as content management systems, or CMSs. So we've got a definition here. A content management system is a tool that enables a variety of centralized technical and decentralized non-technical staff to create, edit, manage, and finally publish in a number of formats a variety of content, such as text, graphics, video, documents, etc., whilst being constrained by a centralized set of rules, process, and workflows that ensure coherent, validated electronic content. So that's really just a flowery way of saying it's a bunch of interfaces that allow us to do exactly what it says, manage content. Okay, so there are some disadvantages of using a CMS, and a lot of these overlap with the disadvantages that we acknowledge that just using dynamic web technologies have, but they can be more complicated to set up. The level of technical knowledge required for the developer and the designer is increased. So as a designer, you need to have some understanding of what the constraints of the underlying CMS that you might be designing for might place upon the limits of the design that you can implement. And usually that's fairly flexible, but that is something that will factor into how much development then is required to go into implementing your design. So that's one of the big reasons that where even though your actual implementation of WordPress as an assignment doesn't come until the second half of the semester, why we want to familiarize you with the technology early on, so that that in some way can inform how much extra effort a certain design may take implementing with as a WordPress theme, for example, as opposed to if you were to just implement that theme as a static based website or that design. Okay, and I say here, these can and will be different for every CMS and are often difficult to determine definitively. So again, a useful reason to play around with it and try it first. So it's always good to fail early and fail often, and then figure out what is possible, so that when you come to creating the final thing, that you have some hindsight to draw upon. So CMSs, because they're sort of pre-packaged, not for any specific individual design problem or website, in some way they're generic, and they're designed to suit a wide range of design problems. So in some way they're an out-of-the-box solution, and if your design goals align very closely with what the intention is for that CMS, then it's probably going to be a fairly smooth process. But there may be cases where you have a fringe case where you have a design which may not necessarily adhere to the design or the development philosophies of a CMS, and in that case, you may have to wrestle with it a little bit in order to get it to do the things that you want. Okay, so many CMSs are extendable or customizable, but even these processes follow certain models and conventions. So that again is just sort of extra knowledge that you need to know. And so you may find at some time, at some point, that you'll be working on a project where it's specialized enough that it may actually make more sense to create your own content management system than use one that already exists. I'd be very surprised if that's the case for anyone's assignment, but that's not to say that it doesn't ever happen in the realm of possible projects. Okay, but that's not something that we necessarily need to worry about. Upgrading to newer versions of a CMS may break things. This is fortunately something which a lot of CMS developers have taken on board as a problem in the past, and it's not so much an issue anymore. WordPress happens to actually be very, very good at maintaining backwards compatibility, but that can be an issue depending on the CMS that you use. Migrating content to a different CMS may be difficult or infeasible. So you may decide that a particular CMS is good to use today, but depending on the lifetime of a website, it may only need to be around for 6 months or a year, but it may need to be around for 10 years. And in this area where things change so rapidly, who's to say that will still be the best solution in 10 years' time, or if it will even exist still in 10 years' time? So that's a difficult question to answer, and often you just have to make a best educated guess. And at the same time, if at some point you decide that another CMS is a better solution, often it's not in the interests of the original CMS that you're using to make it easy for you to take your content out and put it somewhere else. Fortunately, there are CMSs again which do, realize that people may want to do that, and WordPress again is one which will allow you to quite easily export your content in a format that a lot of other CMSs will then re-import. So it's not like you have to go and manually enter all of the content again if you do end up deciding to change CMSs later on. Okay, so as we have mentioned, there are some cases when you shouldn't use a CMS. There are, sort of CMS evangelists who will attempt to tell you that the CMS is the solution for everything. But really, if you've got a website where you have content that doesn't change very much very often, then the overhead of setting up a CMS might just be overkill, might be unnecessary. So you really only want to use a solution that takes more setup time if that setup time is going to be recouped later on in maintaining and managing the website. And so that's usually going to be the case. There's not many websites that you're going to create these days where you just create it and sit it and it leaves there and it never changes. But it is a possibility, and in that case, it may not be worth the extra effort of using a CMS. And as I kind of mentioned before, if the design and or architecture of your website is highly unique, not something that's really a case that CMS may have been designed with that particular use in mind, then you may find it more difficult to attempt to get your unique design or way of doing things to work in the existing framework of a CMS. But again, these are both pretty fringe cases, which for our purposes we don't need to worry about. Okay, so some of the hopefully obvious advantages of using a CMS: makes managing lots of content, constantly updated content, manageable. And so when we talk about management, we mean things like updating, publishing, unpublishing, archiving, searching, moderating, automating of tasks, securing user privileges, all that sort of thing. By providing administration interfaces, it should allow people with little or no understanding of web architecture to become content publishers. Okay, so that's sort of the ideal of all of these CMSs, is that you don't need to employ or waste a highly technical web developer, web designer's time with just being a data entry person. You can provide interfaces that are hopefully simple and logical enough that someone whose job is a writer or an editor can use these and be the content contributors to the website. Okay, and these can be internal and external users. So external users of the website can be leveraged as content contributors as well. You get things like user accounts and privileges, so you can assign different levels of access or different abilities to do different things with the content to different users. So let's say you have a website which is like an online newspaper. In a newspaper, you'll usually have writers, but it's not their job to sort of publish it. It goes through a series of editors, and the editor is the person who ultimately says what will or will not go in the publication. So you can set that sort of thing up in a CMS where you can have people create content, but it's not publicly viewable until someone with publishing privileges actually comes along and goes, yes, we'll publish this and that, or maybe I'll modify it first and then publish it. We've got automation of processes. So, for example, again with publishing, if you want to pre-create content, and this is an example, I do this for my blog, which we use in the tutorials. If I want to create the content ahead of time, but I don't want it to be viewable until a certain date, then I can set it to be viewable in a certain date range, rather than having to come back on that particular date and remember to publish everything. And then things like updating of the core website and the plugins and whatever else you have, that can all be automated. So again, we just don't have to invest so much time manually in maintaining the website. And because there's a common architecture, because everyone who has a WordPress installation, the core code is basically the same, then that allows us to have a common architecture to write reusable plugins and themes for. So if you write a plugin or a theme for your website, then you can quite easily publish it and give it to anyone else to install on their WordPress site, and it should work essentially the same. Okay, so I've got here a list of some common CMS features. So things like automated templates, access control, scalable feature sets, web standards upgrades, delegation and collaboration, document workflow management, and content syndication. I don't really mind if we don't go into those in too much detail here, but there's some of the feature words that you may see associated with various different CMSs. So there are a lot of content management systems. I've got a link here to a Wikipedia article. Let's see if I can click it. Okay, so this is a Wikipedia article which just lists some of the popular ones, and as you can see, there's stacks of them. Okay, just the PHP ones alone. Okay, it's nuts. There's heaps. And some people might say there's too many CMSs. Okay, some people might say it's overkill, but you tend to have people develop a CMS, get quite philosophical about it, and they think their CMS is the best, and then usually a team will fork off that and disagree and create a slightly different one which they think is the best. So the issue with this is, well, which CMS do we choose? I mean, it's not going to be feasible to attempt to go and try out every single one. But some of the things that you want to consider when choosing a CMS is, first of all, your needs, so your existing technological knowledge. So you can see there was a bunch of CMSs in that Wikipedia article that were built with technologies other than PHP. So obviously, if we're teaching you PHP, it's not going to make sense for us to get you to go and do one that's created in ASP or Perl or something else. Okay, so that does have some bearing on it, what your knowledge already is. There's the client needs, and that usually relates to the feature set of the CMS, but also the costs of setting it up, because some of these are free and some of them are commercial, cost money, and time frames in terms of development. But probably most importantly, what the website itself needs, so the CMS options. So things like licensing, your development team, security, if that's very important, and accessibility and code quality. A big one is documentation. Documentation, because you have the best, most fully featured CMS in the world, but if there's no documentation for it, it's going to really hinder your ability to learn how to use it and develop for it, and that's going to add time to the time frame of development. And then training and support, if that's important as well. So I've got a link there to an interesting article on this whole issue, which might be worth a look. So we've got to ask, what are the requirements from the website, from a design perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a technological compatibility perspective. And as I kind of mentioned before, you have to sort of think about what the lifespan of the website's going to be. If this is going to be a solution that's still going to be viable in 6 months, a year, or in 10 years. So the question, when you've got a project and you're thinking about a CMS, is which CMS solution best meets all of these requirements. And really you just kind of have to do your research. A good place to start is look at similar projects and see what CMSs they use, and just general recommendations, but then also where you can actually trying them out and seeing how they go. And you may find that you try maybe a handful, and you start developing the same thing in a handful of CMSs, and it'll pretty quickly become apparent which one's going to suit the project the best. There is a link here to a website called opensourcecms.com, which is actually quite useful because it has demo installations of a whole bunch of open source CMSs that you can actually, without having to install anything yourself, just use a guest login, go in and look at the administration interfaces and how it works and so forth. So that's a good way of quickly looking at a bunch of them without having to spend the time installing them on your own server and getting them up and working. Okay, so this is just a very simple graph, which is only really attempting to illustrate one thing. I've taken 3 of the most common open source PHP-based CMSs here, and I've sort of plotted them on a graph of complexity versus versatility. And the only point I'm trying to make here is that is a fairly obvious point, but as the versatility or the amount of features that a CMS has, then usually the complexity of using it and the learning curve into getting into it becomes more steep. I mean, that's just the same with any application. It's the difference between, you know, getting used to using something like Microsoft Paint versus getting used to using something like Photoshop. Paint's a much simpler application. It's a lot quicker to figure out its limited feature set than all of the inner workings of a very big, complex, feature-rich program like Photoshop. I guess, as you can see here, WordPress sort of sits on the simpler side of functionality, but therefore is a bit easier to get into. Has a bit more of a shallow learning curve, and that's not to suggest that it's underpowered in any way. It's very flexible, quite powerful, and can do a lot more things than most people give it credit for. But that's one of the reasons that we're choosing it as the CMS for you to use for your assignment in this unit. So why WordPress? As I just said, it's a good platform to ease you into the world of content management systems. It's relatively simple, but its functionality can be expanded greatly with a little extra work. Okay, so a lot of the features that it may lack from other more full-featured CMSs, you can actually add quite easily just by installing a few plugins. It's free and open source. One of the biggest reasons is that it's popular. Okay, so I've got a stat here which I just looked up yesterday, which estimates that WordPress is used by actually 19% of all the websites on the World Wide Web. So that's a big chunk. And as a content management system, it has by far the biggest market share, almost 60% question.
Can we get that stat like balanced by site traffic?
If you want to look it up, I'm sure you can. I don't have it right now. But yes, that's a legitimate question to ask by site traffic, and I'm sure there's a lot of heavily trafficked sites that aren't using WordPress as a CMS. But yeah, I don't have that information on me. So the benefits of it being popular are sort of twofold. One is if it's that popular and if it's increasing in popularity, then there's a good chance it's not going to go away anytime soon. Okay, so that's with a view to sort of the long-term management of your website. It's probably going to be unhelpful if you choose a CMS that suddenly goes out of production after you've implemented it. And the other benefit of that is because it's very common, there's a good chance that it's going to have lots of people creating tutorials and documentation for it. And that is one thing that it does have going for it, is excellent documentation. Plenty of third-party tutorials. It's been around for a few years now and is being actively developed, so as I said, it's probably not going away anytime soon. And as I touched upon earlier, it has a good track record of upgrading to new features without breaking old ones. So backwards compatibility is pretty good with WordPress compared to a lot of other content management systems. And it runs on the very common Apache MySQL PHP framework, or server stack, which we looked at last week. So there's a little bit of history. WordPress started out as simply a blogging tool, and that's why I guess it earlier on there was a bit of a resistance to it being called a content management system because it didn't have a lot of the features of a more fully featured one. But really, anything that is a blogging tool is strictly by definition managing content, and it has added a lot of flexibility and features to it to its core set over the years. Okay, so I don't really need to go through any of that stuff. This is just a slide which sort of, again, talks to that point. When WordPress gets the criticism of not being a CMS, which I don't necessarily agree with anyway, but you can, a lot of the, as I said, the criticism usually stems from the fact that, oh, it doesn't have the features that this other CMS does. Most, or if not all of those features can be added through the use of plugins. So you can, I've got a list there which I won't go through, but you can do things that, you know, you wouldn't even necessarily associate with something that's meant to be just a blogging tool. So you can install e-commerce plugins which allow you to have a shopping site using WordPress. There's another plugin or framework that I saw recently called BuddyPress, which actually allows you to implement a full-on social network within WordPress. So as the years go on, that argument that that WordPress is not a CMS just, I feel, get less and less legitimate. This is just an example of one plugin, which is a rebranding plugin for the login page. So the login page, at the point that this slide was created anyway, was not something that you could customize, but there was obviously a need for that. People wanted to do that, so a plugin was created that allowed you to add that functionality. And you can extend the functionality of WordPress basically in any way that you can imagine. That pretty much anything you can do in PHP, you can make WordPress do. Okay, and WordPress sites don't have to look like blogs. Okay, even though it began its life as a blogging tool, there's plenty of WordPress websites that you can look at, and they don't look like what you would think a blog, like a Tumblr or a Blogger site, would look like. And there's just a couple of examples here. These are old now, may not even look like this anymore, but this is a movie trailer website. Doesn't look like a blog. This, I believe, is someone's portfolio website. Again, not what you would traditionally call a blog-based layout. Okay, and there's some links here to other sort of articles with collations of various WordPress sites that don't look like blogs. Okay, but I don't think I need to really harp on that point. Okay, so the server requirements, which I may have mentioned last week, but it bears repeating. As of WordPress version 3.2 at least, your hosting provider needs to have PHP version 5.2.4 or greater installed, MySQL version 5.0 or greater, and Apache is the recommended HTTP server. We'll work on others, but that's the easiest one to get it configured. So that's our classic Apache MySQL PHP server stack, and these are versions which aren't necessarily bleeding edge, so it should be pretty common. I did have a few questions last week about there's some web hosting that uses Dropbox to store its files, and after looking into that more, we determined that isn't actually a solution that will work for installing WordPress, because it simply serves static HTML and CSS files. It doesn't contain the database or PHP. Okay, again, I had a similar slide in last week's lecture about the LAMP server stack or variations of it. Different diagram, but the same general concept. So I don't think I really need to repeat that again. I've got some instructions here on installing WordPress on your remote web server. This content's all duplicated in the tutorial content, and we will go through this, but I'll just sort of mention it and go over it briefly now. So we've got there's a link there to the WordPress's own instructions on installing it, and I sort of summarized those. So you've got 4 main steps. First is to download the WordPress install package, which will be a zip file. Unzip that and upload that to your web server using an FTP client. and then you'll need to create a MySQL database. Thirdly, you'll need to edit a configuration file within WordPress called wp-config.php, and in there you need to put in the details that WordPress needs to know in order to access your MySQL database. And then finally you need to create an administrator account in WordPress's own user account system, and then you can start using WordPress. Okay, so these slides just demonstrate that in more detail. Again, we'll demonstrate this in the tutorials. Okay, so creating the database, again, we'll go through this in more detail in the tutorials, but this is something that you will, on your remote web hosting, you'll probably achieve this through your control panel web-based administration interface that you'll be given access to when you get your web hosting, which hopefully most people have sorted out by now. And I'll be demonstrating in the tutorials how we go about doing that in the cPanel interface, which is a common one, but the solution will be fairly similar in any other control panel interface that you might have anyway. I've got a link there to a specific tutorial on that, setting up the database using cPanel. These are some screenshots which, again, I won't necessarily go over in detail here because we'll look at those in the tutorials. But essentially, this is the cPanel interface. Creating the database, you create a database name. You also need to create a database user. Okay, so we need to have some sort of security around the database itself because we don't just want anyone accessing our database. So we create a user which essentially represents WordPress as a user for the database. We give it a username and password. We assign that user privileges to be able to do things with the database. In the case of WordPress, WordPress needs to essentially do everything. Okay, it needs to be able to query the database for information, but it also needs to be able to create entries and delete them and modify them. So we give it all of the privileges. And then when we've done that, that's everything set up, and we can then tell WordPress those details that we've set up in order to access the database. There's also PHPMyAdmin, which again I did briefly mention last week. This is another interface you might see for setting up databases. If your hosting doesn't have a sort of a wizard style interface for setting it up, you can do it through PHPMyAdmin as well. If you are installing WordPress on the Qt web server for any reason, then that's the interface that you will need to use for that. And I've got notes about that again on my blog, but as we've said, we don't really want you to do that for the assignment anyway, so I'm not going to pay that much attention right now. There's the editing of the wp-config file. So as I said, once we've set up all of the information to do with the database, we've created the database, we've given it a name, we've created a database username, and given them a password. WordPress needs to know all of those bits of information along with where your MySQL server is actually hosted in order to be able to connect to that database. So we need to edit this file and then re-upload it to the server. When you first get the initial installation of WordPress, there's a file in there called wp-config.sample.php. So what you do is you edit that, put in the relevant information, and then you save it as just wp-config.php. So you lose the sample part and re-upload that. And this is what it looks like. Okay, it's just a bunch of configuration information for WordPress, and the bits that I've highlighted here are the bits that we need to put in for to tell it how to connect to our MySQL database. Okay, and once we've done that, we will run a little installation script, and we can create an administrator account for the WordPress site. So this is the account where you actually log into the WordPress site and are able to create posts and edit, delete, install plugins, all of this sort of thing. And so that's all done in a setup interface within WordPress itself. Just a little bit about WordPress's interfaces once it is installed. So there's essentially two sides to WordPress and any CMS really. You've got your front end and your back end interfaces. So the front end interfaces, oh sorry, we'll start with the back end interfaces. The back end interfaces, as an administrator, as a content publisher, where you're going to spend most of your time. And this is where you actually add content, install themes, install plugins, configure settings. Okay, so these, if we just think back to the tutorial last week where we created that very simple dynamic website, the part that was still lacking was any sort of administrative interfaces. In order to add the content, we still had to go into the database and manually add it there. So the CMS adds to that this series of administration interfaces, which means that we can, with nice graphical interfaces, do all of that content management without having to touch the database directly. So that's why I said to you, don't worry about necessarily learning the SQL statements and stuff that we were writing, because these interfaces will do that for you. You have a graphical interface, you hit a button, and then the code to go and handle all of the interfacing with the database is all already existing in WordPress for you. Okay, so as I said, this is where you do all your content management, editing posts, moderating comments, installing plugins and themes, managing user accounts, etc. It requires a login, which, as you saw, you set up during the installation process. And this is where you can give different users different levels of access to this interface too. So you can create, after you've created an administrative user, that user can create other users which you may just want to let them create content but not publish it, or have whatever other access rights you might want to assign to them. Okay, and there's the admin interfaces are always accessible at your domain and then / wp-admin. And then there's just a link there to more detailed documentation about the admin interfaces. Okay, and then the other side is the public or front-end interfaces. So this is what everyone else sees when they go and visit your website. Okay, this is what happens when you just go to the root domain of your website, and so this is just the content. These aren't interfaces to manage the site. This is just the front end content, what the public are intended to see. And this ostensibly is the part that you ends up changing when you apply a theme to it. So your theming will be to theme the front end interfaces. Okay, and just an extra point here that obviously once you've published the content, you'll probably want to go and check the front end interface to see what it looks like. So there's usually a bit of back and forth between creating content and then refreshing the front end interface, seeing what it looks like, and if it doesn't look quite right, going back and making some changes. Okay, so we'll talk about WordPress themes now. So WordPress can install themes to change the look and feel of the site. So this, as we said before, was one of the advantages of having a common underlying framework, is that they can have a theme framework whereby you can install existing themes or create your own and then share it with other people if you want, or even sell it for other people to install on their WordPress sites. And this only works because we have sort of the separation of the content with the logic and the styling. So a theme changes nothing about the content of your site. It simply changes how that content is laid out and presented. So I haven't updated this. It says your first assignment here is to create your own WordPress theme. Both your assignments are really that. The second part is creating it. The first part is the proposal for it, which uniquely services the content and purposes of your site, in this case your own personal portfolio. This is a screenshot of the WordPress themes administration interface. So it shows you the theme that you currently have installed, the theme that you currently have activated and any other themes that you have installed. So you can have a bunch of themes sitting in your WordPress site, and but obviously you can only activate one at a time. So there's two parts to getting a theme to work. You install it, so it exists on your site, and then you choose to activate one. And there's various information that goes along with describing the theme. There's a WordPress themes directory. Question?
Can that be per page?
Themes.
Yes.
Normally, if you want to have a different layout per page, there would be separate templates within the one theme. Yeah. Okay. There's a WordPress themes directory, which is just the site on WordPress's or the section on WordPress's site where you can go and browse existing freely available themes. And so you simply just download these, upload them, and activate them. There's also an interface where you can do that directly through WordPress now as well. But there's myriads of other places where you can get themes from, free or commercial. There's quite a large industry developed now around actually creating for sale WordPress themes and frameworks. But that's not so much important to us because you're going to be making your own theme. But we should discuss the advantages and disadvantages of using a pre-made theme. So the advantages are you don't have to develop it. Okay, all it takes to install is download and install it and activate it. And there's a lot of well-made free themes, and you can take an existing theme and depending on the license it's released under, you can modify it to suit your own needs. Now the disadvantages are that, again, any generic solution is never going to perfectly suit your specific design problem or design solution. So it's impossible for them, unless they're making a bespoke theme for you, for them to know what your content and aesthetic is beforehand. And depending on how much customization you do to it, it can actually end up taking you longer and costing you more than doing your own from scratch. And obviously you're not going to learn anything about theme development if you just install one. Okay, so advantages and disadvantages of creating your own theme from scratch. Pretty much the disadvantage is the flip side for that. Okay, it's obviously going to take you a bit longer to create your own, and you have to learn how to make themes. But once you've learned how to make one, it's quite easy to make another one and another one and another one after that. Now the advantages. It's going to be unique. Okay, you know exactly what your or your client's needs are going to be, so you can tailor the perfect exact theme to exactly what the website and the content and the client needs. It'll be completely flexible and customizable. You have complete control over your own resources, so a lot of the time if you download a theme, you may only actually be using a small portion of that, but all that code's still there being sort of loaded into memory and used. So if you just have your own theme, then you only use the bits that you actually need. And of course you get to learn how to make themes. Okay, we'll look at the anatomy of a WordPress theme. So what actually goes into making up a WordPress theme? How do all the pieces fit together? And hopefully based on what we looked at last week in the tutorials, a lot of the philosophies of this will be similar to what we saw with all of the things that we went through in that tutorial with just PHP and a database by itself. So first of all, WordPress themes are installed to a directory in the WordPress installation called wp-config, and underneath that a themes subdirectory. So you can see in this picture here, there's 3 themes installed in WordPress here, but only one of those will be activated, and we use that administration interface for the themes, as we saw earlier, to actually choose which one becomes activated. A WordPress theme simply consists of a collection of PHP files and CSS files, and then associated resources like imagery and JavaScript files. Okay, and so essentially the theme itself is you can almost view that as its own little PHP application that exists within the wider WordPress framework. And so WordPress will load up, and then it loads up the theme, and it's the theme code in there that handles the outputting of the content and the layout and all of that stuff. So the PHP files contain, very much like we saw last week in the tutorials, they contain HTML markup interspersed with PHP snippets which retrieve content from the WordPress database and output the results to plain HTML for the browser to render. Okay, so this is very similar to what we did last week. The only difference here is rather than, it's actually a bit simpler, because rather than having to write our own functions to retrieve the information for the database and using raw PHP code, essentially all we're doing here is calling built-in WordPress functions which will output a certain bit of information about the blog. Okay, so in this screenshot here, there's an example of some of the PHP snippets. This last one here, for example, is calling a WordPress function called blog info, passing it a string parameter called name, and that will simply be replaced with the name of the site, which you can then change through an administration settings interface. And because, again, as we saw last week there, because it's written dynamically here in PHP, if we then go and change the site later on, we don't have to come back to this file and modify this at all. It will automatically, when we save the name of the site in the administration interface, it'll be sent to the database, and then this function will simply go and pull whatever that current bit of information is out of the database for the site name, and then insert it here in this part of the template. So these things are called, these things which output the information, or the WordPress functions that output the information, are called template tags. WordPress calls them template tags. And so I've got a note here. I mean, I already just said this about the template tag blog info, which is so this is, I guess this is very similar to the previous slide, but again, just to reiterate here, shown in the PHP and the resulting HTML output, the highlighted lines here. So this is simply designed to output, again, the name of the blog within a certain part of the HTML, in this case in between the title attributes of the head, the title elements of the head section of the HTML file. And again, just to iterate, I know I keep hammering this point, but it's very important that by the time it gets back to the browser, okay, all it's seeing is the resulting HTML output. So needless to say that these template tag functions are going to save us a lot of writing our own PHP code. As I said last week, there's really not a lot of PHP code that will end up having to write other than simply calling WordPress's built-in functions. So what we really need to know is what are these functions and how do we find them, very much like we needed to know what the PHP functions were and how to find them last week. So these WordPress's functions and template tags are all documented on their website, and I've got 2 links to them there. So there's one for template tags and one for function references. There's a little bit of crossover between them. Essentially, these are all WordPress functions, but they have a subset of their functions which they call template tags, which they say they call them that to differentiate them as functions used for theme development as opposed to functions used for core WordPress development. But essentially they're all PHP functions built into WordPress, and there's a bit of crossover between them. But you'll find all of them underneath the template tags and the function references. Another good way of finding out what does what is to look at other themes and see what kind of WordPress functions they're outputting and comparing the output and seeing what exactly it is doing. And then obviously Googling it. As I said, WordPress has stacks of great tutorials and simple examples of everything from the entire process of creating themes to using one particular function or template tag. Okay, so we'll look at the page structure of a WordPress theme. So how it's separated into its various template files. Again, this is going to be similar to what we did separating out our PHP files in the tutorial last week. So WordPress page structure can be logically sectioned into a number of building blocks, as demonstrated by this image on the right here. And each of these blocks corresponds to a separate PHP file in the theme directory. Okay, very much similar to what we did last week. The only thing that we need to make note of here is that WordPress expects these files to be named a certain way. So unless you name them the exact correct way, it's not going to know to find them. And they're pretty logically named. So for example, the header section, it expects to be called header.php, and then you've got footer.php and sidebar.php for those parts as well. Each block, a file, can be included and reused in multiple page templates using template tags like PHP, like the get header template tag here. Okay, so again, this is very similar to what we were doing last week when we were just simply including, say, the header.php file, except for WordPress to do it, we call a built-in WordPress function. So the get header WordPress function, if you were to go and look at its code, what it would simply be doing would be probably looking for the header.php file in your theme directory and then using an include or require statement to include that in the overall PHP combined code. Okay, and this is just sort of another demonstration of that. So again, this goes to what we did last week. The way that you divide up the various parts of the theme into the template files is logically based on what's a modular or reusable bit of the code. So the header section, if it doesn't change, makes sense to put it in its own file. Same deal with the sidebar, the footer, and then having the content area as its own section. And then it's easy for us to combine all those into whatever combination we want. If we want a certain page that does have the sidebar, we can include that. If we don't want it to have the sidebar, we just don't include it. Okay, it gives us a lot of flexibility over the layouts without having to create the entire page layout each time. Again, this is just a demonstration of how the constituent template files get included into the index PHP file. Again, very similar to what we did last week. Okay, this is a pretty important diagram here, just in terms of understanding how WordPress decides what template file to use based on what resource or what URL you're trying to access. And it's going to be difficult probably to read on this screen because it's quite a detailed diagram, and I've linked it here on the WordPress website, and they've actually updated the diagram, but it's essentially the same. But this is worth looking at. If you can grasp this, then I think it makes the reason that you have templates called certain things a lot more clear. So this is essentially a big flow diagram of how WordPress decides which template files to load up based on what kind of resource you're attempting to look at. So it asks you what page you're looking at, and it will determine that using the URL and the get parameters as we looked at last week. And there's going to be certain kinds of pages. If you've typed in a URL that doesn't exist, then it's going to be an error 404 page. Okay, so for example, if it detects that, then it will first attempt to look for a template file called 404.php. Okay, so if you want an error message to show up there, you put that inside of that. Now, if you don't have that, what it's going to do is revert to the index.php file. And you'll notice that in every single case, if any of these other template files don't exist, it always reverts back to the index.php file. Okay, so that means that your simplest WordPress theme can essentially just be an index.php file. If every page on your website is going to look essentially the same except for the content that's output, then you can just have an index.php file. But that would be a pretty simple website. So for example, you might have, to go to your question before, you might have a bunch of different categories on your website and you might want to theme them differently. In this case, you could have a series of different category templates. And so what WordPress would do here then is, depending on the URL, if you entered a URL which pointed to a category of post, then it would attempt to first look for a category template tag or a series of category template tags, and there's a few different variations of these. First, it would look for one which is category hyphen and then slug.php, and slug is simply a short descriptive word of what that category is. Okay, so if I had a category called photography, for example, then my category slug might just be photography, and it would look for a template file first called category hyphen photography. If it didn't find that, it would then look for one which was category hyphen then an ID. So each category in WordPress will have an associated ID with it, so you could also have a template which uses that to define it. Then if it doesn't find that one, it will attempt to find a template file which is just called category.php. So you may just have one template file which is generically applied across any page which happens to be a category page, but you still want that different to your index page maybe. Okay, and so for that you can just use a category.php. Finally, if it doesn't find that, it will go through a series of others and then always revert back to index.php. So if there's no reason for you to have a different layout on your category page, then you don't have to go and create these extra templates. You could just always have it revert back to index.php, but it's just showing, it'll just be the content that changes. It'll show a particular category of posts rather than all of the posts. Okay, so it can look quite complicated, but the point is here that you just use what you need. Okay, so you use as much or as little of the template hierarchy as you want. If you only need one layout, then you only need to have that one template, and then you add other layouts as required by the different sections of your site. So we'll just have a quick look at some of the most common template files. And as I mentioned before, okay, these have to be named this way. In order for WordPress to be able to find them, they have to be named these things. So the header.php file usually contains the doc type, metadata, and head section of the HTML document, and it may contain the top navigation. You include the header and other template files to avoid duplicating the code it contains with the getHeader template tag or function. The footer is essentially exactly the same, except it's anything that you would normally put in the footer, and you include it using the getFooter template tag. The sidebar can contain basically whatever you want, but commonly it contains navigation, a series of links, maybe a search form, and as we'll look at a little bit later, you can have widgetized plugins that can be added and removed through the administrator interface, which I'll discuss a little bit more in a second. But again, logically enough, you include the sidebar using the getSidebar template tag. Now you'll notice that the getSidebar function actually takes a parameter called name, because you can have multiple sidebars if you want. You might have a left and a right sidebar, and so you can include include whichever one that you want by essentially assigning it a name and telling it through this parameter which sidebar you want to include. So you could include different sidebars on different pages, different templates, or multiple on the same page, or any combination of those things. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about when I say the sidebar widgets. So widgets are essentially little bits of self-contained, almost little mini applications, but they're designed to be able to be really easily added and removed through a administration interface. So essentially, you define an area of the template which can accept these widgets, and then you install a widget as a plugin, and you go to an administration interface which simply allows you to drag and drop certain widgets, usually to a sidebar. So as you can see here, this is on the left here, this is what the administration interface looks like, where I would drag the different widgets in and you configure them here, and then the resulting output, without having to go and modify anything in the template, is these standalone little widgets output on the home page or wherever they happen to be. So you get things like calendars and lists of recent posts. You'll see on my blog I have a bunch of them, tag clouds, things like that. There's a myriad of different widgets, and I'm sure you'll find one that will satisfy the social plugin requirement that you need for your portfolio as well, whether that's a Twitter or a LinkedIn or a Facebook or whatever else you want to add there. Okay, so the content section, this is where you'll spend most of your time developing the theme. So first of all, I guess we need to talk about what makes up the content in WordPress. So WordPress is quite nicely simple in this respect, in which everything is going to be either one of two types of content, and that's going to be a post or a page. So your post is designed to be like a blog post. So in one template, it's common to have a series of posts output, or at least excerpts of posts output on that page. A page, as defined as a content type in WordPress, on the other hand, is meant to be just a standalone page by itself. You click on a link to that page or enter the URL, and all you see is that page's content. Okay, so the three main template files associated with displaying these are single.php, page.php, and index.php. And I'll go through those. So index.php is your default, I say here default front page, but it's really your default page for everything unless you create a more specific template for something else. It usually displays excerpts of recent posts, but really it displays whatever you tell it to in the template, but that's what it's most commonly used for. And we use something called the WordPress loop to output the posts, and we'll look at that in more detail in the tutorials, but that will go back to how I was kind of stressing the importance of the concept of loops in PHP last week. This is the one place where you will have to use a loop in order to output a series of posts within a template. And it usually includes other constituent templates like the header, footer, and maybe the sidebar. The single.php template is what it looks to load if you click on say the title of a post. So let's say you've got the home page, you've got a list of posts. You can click on usually at the title of these posts, and it will link to the full content of that single post and just display that by itself. So when you navigate to that URL, the template it will attempt to load is called single.php. If that doesn't exist, it will just revert back to the index.php file. So it displays the entire contents of a single post, and it may display comments also if enabled. And again, it usually includes the header and footer template files as well. Page.php is what is used if you navigate to a content item which you've created as a page in the WordPress backend. So it displays the contents of a WordPress page content item. Also may display comments, and again usually includes the header and footer. The categories.php file is, so WordPress supports custom taxonomies, including in two ways. It includes categories and it includes tags. They're similar, but categories are sort of self-contained like folders, whereas tags work sort of across categories. But normally the taxonomy that you will use first is categories, particularly as a way of navigating the site. So, for example, here's a screenshot of a slightly older version of Smashing Magazine website, which is built on WordPress, and it is essentially a blog, but they have a series of different sections which you can go to. So rather than just having one template where you have to trawl through and see everything, it makes sense if you're interested in a particular category to be able to click on that and just show that category of posts. So if we want a different template for the categories section to our index page, then this is where we can use the categories.php file. Yep. Okay. Now the functions.php file is sort of different. It's different in that it doesn't map to anything that you visually see. All of the other template files that we've looked at so far, they map to something, a URL that you go to and a bit of content that you see. The functions.php file is simply just a place to store bits of PHP code that may be referenced from other templates. Okay, so you could, if again we sort of refer to last week's tutorial, you could put this akin to the database PHP file that I had. It had a bunch of functions which connected to the database and retrieved information. I never visited that page, but I simply included it in my other template files so I could call those functions. So this is a very similar thing. Often you'll have bits of reusable code, which we know we use as functions, that will perform some task that may be useful that's not already built into WordPress that we might need. And so for that we create a file called functions.php, and again it has to be called this because WordPress looks for that to automatically include it. So we don't have to, unlike last week where I was having to include or require my database PHP file into the other files in which I wanted to reference it from. The functions, as long as you name it, this WordPress will automatically include the functions PHP file, and you can just call functions contained within it from wherever you need. And often when you're setting up certain aspects of the WordPress site, like menus, for example, or some plugins, then you'll need to add customization information to this file. Okay. Okay, so we've had a brief overview at a look of some of the more common template files. As you saw from the diagram, there's a whole myriad of others. You probably won't need to use most of them, but it's worthwhile looking at them and seeing what they do at least, so you know if it will or won't be useful for you. So I've got a bunch of links here for more detail on just WordPress theme development in general. And I've just repeated the two links to the function reference and the template tags there, which we'll be referring to a lot when we're creating our themes. And a lot of this, as I said, we'll go through in more detail and demonstrate in the tutorials. Okay, you've also got navigation menus is a big thing in WordPress theming templates. And there's various ways of doing this, but again, essentially this all boils down to calling a particular WordPress function in the appropriate place where you want to output the menu. Now there's been different ways of doing the menus in WordPress over the various different versions. This information is actually a little bit old now. It used to be that you could really only output easily a list of pages or a list of categories, and that's what you got. Now there's sort of more flexible ways of creating a menu where you can actually choose specifically what categories and pages to put on a menu through an administration interface, and then there's other functions to output that within the template. But we'll look at that in more detail in the tutorials. So what about the CSS? We haven't really talked about this yet, and the good news here is it's pretty much the least different part about developing the website. The one thing that you do need, again, is to know that there's a naming convention. So WordPress expects that your main style sheet will be called style.css. But you can have other style sheets that you also include, or you include in the main style sheet using import statements or whatever. Okay, but the point here is that, again, to harp on this point over and over again, the end result of all of the PHP WordPress output that your browser sees is going to be HTML. Okay, so the way that you implement the CSS is going to be no different. All you have to do is know what the output HTML is going to be. You're still going to be outputting CSS classes and IDs and HTML tags, so the way that you target them with your CSS is going to be no different. The only reason it's going to be slightly more difficult to develop is because because as we've seen, you can't necessarily load up the PHP locally. It has to run on the web server, and so there's a little bit of a logical disconnect between what the ultimate HTML output will be just from looking at the PHP code. But this is where tools like Firebug or whatever equivalent developer tools, code inspection tools in the browsers that you have come in really handy, because they allow you to inspect that generated HTML and see what CSS is applied, and allow you to tinker with it there and then go back and apply that to your original code. This is also one of the big reasons why over the web design units here we've avoided using any kind of visual WYSIWYG editors like the visual interface of Dreamweaver, because if you got used to applying your styles that way using static HTML and CSS files, as soon as you start adding PHP into that, it's not going to work, because it's not going to be able to process the PHP and load it up and allow you to see those changes instantly. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about installing the theme. It's pretty simple, but again, there's some conventions to follow. So WordPress looks for some predefined text in a comment block at the top of your style.css file, so it can display this information about the theme in the administrator interface. So this is an example of the CSS comment information at the top of one of the built-in themes, and it's essentially just some predefined sort of text headings with some information. So things like the name, the URL where you can find the theme, a description of it, version, author, and tags. It will also look for a file called screenshot.png in the template directory to provide a preview thumbnail of the theme. So one of the last things you should do once you've developed your theme is take a screenshot of what it looks like and then put that in the theme folder, so that if you or anyone else is installing the theme, that will show up in the theme administration interface. Okay, so that's what it looks like in the theme administration interface. So the part on the right here is the description. Okay, that's all pulled from that top comment section in the style.css file, and then the thumbnail there is the screenshot.png file that you include. And so installing the theme then is simply a matter of putting the theme folder in the wp-config.php/themes directory, and then going to the themes administration interface and activating it. Okay, so in summary, WordPress theme development is essentially all of your static web design philosophies, principles that you already know, plus the added power that we've already started to explore of PHP in the dynamic web.